Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. This is the series on debt, and I have a returning guest today, Clif Mark, who, what did we call that episode? Plato and Anarchism? Came on to talk about Plato.
Something about democracy, Athens, anarchy.
Yeah, Plato, Democracy, Athens, Anarchy. I highly recommend that episode and all of the episodes of Clif's podcast, Good in Theory, which I still have to hope someday will return to publication.
Thanks, Graham. I hope so, too.
All right, so I'm here today. I thought of you immediately when I was going through debt, and I got to this chapter on honor, because I thought I know a guy who works on honor. But before we get into Graeber, can you just tell us a bit how you use these terms, honor and dignity, your work in that? Because I know you and Graeber have different approaches. Graeber is just trying to synthesize like every philosophical tradition in the world into a history of everything in this book.
Yeah, I don't know that he's necessarily... I don't know that he's trying to synthesize, but he's like, I have some ideas and I will, pick examples from 8 different cultures that kind of illustrate something that I might be talking about.
Yeah.
Which is a very fertile and interesting way to do it. Yeah, but it sometimes makes him hard to nail down.
Yeah, he is very hard to nail down. So tell us what honor is, at least as far as you're concerned, then we can get to Graeber.
Okay, right. So, look, I'm going to have a lot more to say about what I have to say about honor than Graeber, because I know my work better. But so I did my PhD research on honor and dignity and what I called the politics of respect. So the idea was we have all this talk about recognition and disrespect and things that are offensive, and it seemed to be an important thing. And we have different ways of conceptualizing why recognition is important. And a lot of that was conceived in a historical narrative where now recognition should be about dignity, equal dignity. But in the bad old days, in the aristocratic macho days, it was honor. And so we moved from like medieval macho honor for elites and aristocrats to democratic dignity. And that's a good thing. And like the contemporary politics of recognition and identity are sort of a final working out of what equal dignity means. So on that story, honor and dignity, both kind of about recognition, but separate. Honor, hierarchical, violent, bad. Dignity, equal, peaceful, good, right? And so my work was kind of trying to undermine that view. So there's a bunch of thinkers, like James Whitman at Yale is one. Waldron writes some stuff about it, where they trace a kind of lineage from honor to dignity. So my interest was, okay, how do we get, what was honor actually like in the early modern period? And how does that transform into dignity? And so my whole thing was, they're kind of the same. They're different, but there's continuities. And therefore, there are resources within bad old honor cultures. I was particularly interested in dueling culture, that are useful for thinking about how we might want to conceive or run a society based on equal respect today. So I know that was a very long-winded answer, but as quickly as I could summarize, that was it.
No, that was quite short and concise. I'm going to take us off track because as we are recording tomorrow, there's going to be a new Star Wars TV show out on Disney Plus, which I have no interest in, but everywhere I go on the internet, I guess the tracking ads have caught me and they think I care about this Star Wars TV show. And I don't know, there must be like a Black Jedi in it or something. I haven't looked into it, but there's just been this huge diversity, equity, inclusion push about it. And the person who is running Star Wars now, Kathleen Kennedy, I was fed some quote, so again, some ad or something, some quote that I clicked on where she was like, everyone deserves to be seen in the Star Wars universe or something like that. So this is this narrative of dignity, I guess. Like, does this tie into what you're this like if your identity group is not included in Star Wars, you have lost dignity or something? I don't know. If this doesn't work at all, we can drop it. But
no, that's okay. So in a lot of my research, because these were such hot topic things, I wanted to conceive of them as instance of the larger category of trying for a society of equal respect. So we will say, or I will say that modern democratic societies, we want to respect everyone equally. And there's a lot of disagreement over what that means. So inclusion of all identity groups in Star Wars is like that's one view of what it means to recognize everyone as an equal. But of course, a lot of people will be like, we don't care. This is not that important. This is sort of an irrelevant thing. And why are you making such a big deal out of nothing? And yeah, so this does fit into arguments over dignity, and what dignity means. For me, what makes these things interesting, and this is where I would get sometimes, into arguments, is I like these ones. I like the offenses and the controversies where there's no obvious harm being done to anyone, right? Where you really have to do some theoretical work to conceive of why anyone's getting hurt by this. Because if there's not an obvious material interest at stake, like suffering, hurt, whatever, then you have to start thinking, what is it? And then you get into stuff about honor and insult and status.
Yeah. Okay. So this is good. So we don't have to take this claim seriously that like a huge aspect of justice is that every identity is represented in the Star Wars universe, but it's part of this idea that in a democratic society people need equal dignity, and if every Jedi is a white British guy, it seems like in the Star Wars universe at least dignity has not been extended equally. And so someone who has one way to deal with this project of getting dignity for everyone is to make sure that Star Wars is a very inclusive place with respect to identity.
Sure. Look, this is one way to conceive of what identity is. I don't watch a lot of Star Wars, No, I don't mind that much, but I do think that like to make representation like that an issue is fine. And I think what's more telling in terms of equality is not so much whether in fact everyone is included in Star Wars or any other series, but the fact that people can stand up and make those claims and then be heard and taken seriously. And so that I think is like an embodiment of equal respect and equality. The very fact that someone can, hey, this is really exclusive, we should have representation, and people will take it seriously and talk about it, I think is a good sign. In terms of
great. No. Okay, good. So we're there. So that's the thing that's happening in Star Wars is whether or not they're actually helping anyone or anything by expanding the identitarian options for Jedi. The fact that people are talking about it makes it clear that they've identified this problem we have, that our society is less democratic than it could be. We've extended dignity to fewer groups than we could. And, Kathleen Kennedy doesn't control the United States government, but she does have a certain amount of control over who is recognized in Star Wars, and she's trying to make the world a better place so more people are recognized.
Or maybe she's just improving their engagement on Twitter,
Yeah, okay. Yeah. All right, we'll leave that cynical response aside. All right. I mean, that's probably true. That's my like anti-corporate
I don't think
reading,
it makes me a cynic to believe that Disney executives.
No. But if we're going to take her at face value, that's what she's doing. And, she probably thinks she's doing both. All right. I took us off of that. So let's get to Graeber. So Graeber has this phrase in this chapter that he says, honor is surplus dignity. And I wasn't quite sure what that meant, but based on what you have just said about dignity, I think I can actually make sense of it. I can put Clif and Graeber together. So if essentially dignity is something that every human being has in some sort of state of nature. No one is a slave. No one is a king. Nothing is hierarchical. The way you get honor is to enslave someone, defeat them, coerce them, whatever, which takes their dignity level from 1, the dignity level that we are all at, to a half a dignity or a 0 dignity if they are enslaved. And then if you have proof of that you did that to them, that you are responsible, that 1 point of dignity goes to you. And so honor is each dignity point you have above 1, and then dishonor or enslavement or disgrace or shame is your dignity below one. And so that's my tip to square this democratic dignity with honor, with Graeber's honor is surplus dignity. How does that sound for the two of them together?
Um, so I don't really buy how important Graeber makes degradation to honor, right? So he wants to say, yeah, you're only honorable insofar as you can enslave others others or degrade them or deprive them of honor. But like that's that he may find cases where that's true, but there are plenty of cases where it's not. I make a distinction between these are such annoying academic sounding words, but we'll say categorical honor or categorical recognition and comparative. So one is just the basic status that gets you into the group and makes you count as a full member. And then we can distinguish between on the pecking order within that group, right? So you're a member of the faculty, you're an academic in good standing, but there might be someone who has a chair or has more rewards and they have a little more esteem than you, but you're both supposed to like treat each other with respect due to equals. And I think both dignity and honor work that way. So when we're talking about dignity and we make that contrast, we're talking about modern dignity because, of course, earlier on, people would say the dignity of a king, the dignity of a judge. It used to be more comparative, like honor. And so these things both transform over time. So to make the contrast between dignity and honor in a past honor society is not going to work perfectly, right? And I would say that in the heroic societies he's talking about, and in Greece and so on, in a lot of honor societies, it may very well be true that you gain honor, some standing within the pecking order by conquering more people, enslaving more people, whatever. But that, to me, in the ones that I study, is not the essence of what it means to be honorable. In my work, honor is usually about the relationships between honorable equals, right? So you care about what your colleagues think and their accolades and this and that. And the people who aren't part of the circle, maybe they're dishonored. They're just not part of it. They're not the people you're focusing on. And so trying to make honor based entirely on the degradation of others, I think it's a sneaky trick and kind of does not really get at why the people in honor societies like thought their own honor was important. It wasn't just about they had more slaves or fewer slaves. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, especially, thinking about Greece, because Graeber talks about this chapter in Greece, how one of the ways you could accrue honor in Athens was, to serve on a jury, to do the democratic work of governance. There's absolutely no degradation there, right? But as a Athenian citizen, you accrue honor by doing these tasks, and all that happens is that everyone in Athens benefits. So that seems like a non-degradative,
right? Degrading,
yeah, non-degrading form of honor there. That's even in Graeber's chapter.
Sure. There's those kinds of honor that you don't necessarily have to degrade anyone to obtain, and there's like honor that was conceived much more like you described dignity. So early modern period, if you're a gentleman, if you're well-born, if you're gentry, you would say you're born with honor. It's kind of yours to lose, right? We'll make an assumption that you have a certain status, you're entitled to a certain form of respect and treatment. And everyone has that equally, unless they dishonor themselves. It's sort of a separate question, also confusingly using the word honor, of where you stand on the pecking order, how much property you have, what exploits you've done, etc.
So we talked a little bit off the air about how, what Graeber's really interested in or worried about is the quantification of all of these things. Like, because that's, I was even using the idea of like one dignity point per human or something like that, moving into Graeber's idea. So is honor normally quantified, or is it more nebulous than that?
I think, well, Graeber doesn't like a lot of quantification, but he's okay with the number one, right?
Yeah.
One life, one person.
Yeah.
That's a human economy for him. That's as high as he wants to count. And I think in at least the early modern honor societies that I studied, that was the most important kind. It is you're in or you're out, right? It is, do you have this, the one? Have you not been dishonored? Do you count as an equal that you can show your face and stand tall in front of anyone or not? Then other stuff, it wouldn't be sharply quantified, but you would say, oh, this person, this professor achieved this much. They wrote this book, so have this much renown. Or, this gentleman went to war and he did this. And that would be comparative, but it wouldn't be quantified in the way I think that Graeber finds objectionable. Yeah.
Okay, I want to get us, back to slavery and the market and these claims Graeber makes, but maybe before we get there, maybe this will get us there. I guess, I mean, if I'm thinking from Graeber's side and the way that honor is degradation, so I've got this happy example of the Athenian citizen who serves, and
Mhm.
he has his, and it's definitely a he, his one honor that is also somewhat increased by his service. I think Graeber would say that honor does completely depend on the degradation of every woman in that society, every foreigner in that society, every enslaved person, every barbarian in the world. Does that one in Athens at least still not require the degradation of others?
Well, what do you mean? Like, how does it require it?
Well, I mean, whenever I paint even the slightest rosy picture of Athens, people email me to tell me that women had no rights and that the wealth of it was based on slavery. And I think
Sure.
Graeber would say that's the degradation there. If you're a free man in
Uh-huh.
Athens, it's because someone else is farming or mining,
Right.
essentially,
Okay.
on
So
your behalf.
in that case, we could say that under certain economic conditions that may still obtain today, uh, degradation in the form of having to work, which, I wouldn't wish on anyone, um, is necessary to afford the freedoms that meant you could be an honorable Greek citizen. So, yes, in order to engage in political practice, go down to the assembly, etc., you needed some leisure, you needed some spare time, and therefore someone had to be doing the work. And it was pretty, labor intensive society. They didn't have a lot of tech or steam engines or anything. So, why are they rich enough to have all this leisure? Well, because they're getting other people to do the work. They're enslaving them. There, I think there's an argument for an economic instrumental dependence on it, but I don't see it as a conceptual dependence, right? So suppose they had, robots or whatever,
Mm.
all the labor saving devices that we imagine now that should have freed us. um, you might think, well, you could get a lot of spare time anyway, and you could live an honorable life, or you could change your conception of what it means to be honorable, and you don't necessarily have to have slaves, right? So there was still a very strong dueling culture in France in the 19th century, right? And we're talking like under a republic. There's no slavery. They'd abolished it. And yet people still felt that they had honor and it was very important to them. They didn't ascribe it to everyone in society. You're right. Women would be excluded. But I don't think it was essential to the idea of a mutual equal respect that we have a separate class of slaves.
Got it. Okay, so if someone comes to Athens and says, "Hey, I've invented the steam engine, and all of your work is going to be uh, done for you. You no longer have slaves, and in fact, don't worry, I found a space for the slaves to go settle in Turkey. So there's no longer any degradation. Athenian honor survives. It requires degradation in this economic sense, but it
Mm.
doesn't. Your honor does not accrue from enslaving other people. Graeber has obviously found examples. I think in the main chapter, I think the main one in the chapter is the Irish slave girls, where
Mm-hmm.
like literally your honor is based on the degradation of others. And you're telling me that is one way to count and assess honor, but there's many ways to assess honor that do not require this kind of, as as other people. It's almost like a vampiric metaphor. Like you're draining off people's
Right.
life force, their dignity, and turning it into your honor. That is a way of doing honor, but it is not honor, which Graeber sort of suggests it is.
Exactly. I mean, I don't know what honors an English word, right? And we're using it in translation to many different societies, and it's going to mean different things in different cases. But the things that a lot of like other anthropologists than Graeber and political theorists recognize as honor are compatible with, not having an entire degraded class of people. Um, and I get the, fun of saying something depends on its opposite.
Yeah.
So, oh wow, this feels really smart to say, but um, I just that's why I asked you. I'm like, how does it depend? It might be an economic dependence. It might be something else. It might be a conceptual dependence, but I don't see in Graeber the argument for that. Yeah,
Yeah, he's found places where it seems like it's a conceptual dependence, but even in some of the examples that
yeah,
he uses, it seems like it's not a conceptual dependence. That makes sense. I mean, he's making big arguments, as we
yeah.
said, where he's sweeping in. Yeah, lots of different examples. Okay, so this takes us to Graeber argues that honor and slavery in Roman law underpins basically everything in our. I mean, it's a like basically like, I think this is the chapter where he says like the reason why you and I can like sell our labor, the reason why we can get jobs is
Mhm.
because Roman law identifies us as a piece of property owned by us, and that
Yeah,
this wouldn't have made sense in Roman or Athenian society, that the freeborn citizen could be such a piece of property. But the logic of degrading slavery has taken over all of us, and the result is capitalism. I think he's very convincing in showing
uh-huh.
where all of these words like domestic and family come from slavery. I'm utterly convinced by that.
Sure.
I found that eye opening. I'm not as convinced by this claim, and I just wanted to see if you could do anything with it.
So the claim is that Roman law is based on the essential distinction between the citizen, the paterfamilias, and the slave, and that determines how all of our property and political relations uh, play
Yeah,
out.
yeah. So it depends on the distinction between the paterfamilias and the slave.
Mhm.
But over the course of history, what was ultimately determined is that even the paterfamilias is a slave. He's just a slave to himself,
Right.
and he can freely sell himself into slavery for perpetuity or for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And so
Uh-huh.
we are all legally degraded slaves because of this journey of this Roman concept to today.
Yeah. So in this part of Graeber's argument, I find it interesting. I like to hear about the history of words, cool. And undoubtedly, the heritage of Roman law has been enormously influential globally. Totally convincing. Um, but whether it still carries, whether the moral horror or distaste we find at the relationships of freedom and slavery in the Roman context carry over to now because we have a similar legal vocabulary, conceptual and verbal. I'm not as convinced, right? So when I took notes on that, I said, well, this is an interesting legal hypothesis, and it sounds plausible to me as a historical story, but I don't I don't know what the theoretical payoff is supposed to be, because as a matter of fact, we've abolished slavery, and being able to get a job is not the same thing. So in what way is it the same, and in what way is it different? And I think there's probably pretty significantly, like ethically significant ways in which the two are different. Um, and just he says domus and domestic and family are from the word for slavery, but I studied Latin, and I think if I remember correctly, egregious used to mean very good, right? And so does that mean everything that is very bad is actually very good? It doesn't. It's just, language changes, concepts, how we use them change. And you want to look at how it works now, if instead of just saying, hey, look, something was the same 2,000 years ago.
So, I'll put it in the way, if anyone who's been listening to this podcast all along knows that I started this podcast because I quit my job, and I quit my job because I was just being treated terribly by my bosses, and I couldn't figure out why they were allowed to treat me this way. I just couldn't figure it out, and pretty much everyone I spoke to who didn't have an academic background was just like, you why are you upset by this? This is what bosses do. This is what it means to have a job. And the person who I found who gave me a sort of certain answer to this was Graeber, which is why I started the podcast. And he points out one of the things. No, he doesn't point this out. Actually, I read this somewhere else. But boss and master are the same word. But people didn't like in the United States. People didn't like having a master. In Europe, like, oh yeah, we have masters. That's fine. The master blacksmith, and it was really propaganda by the plantation owners that they were the master. They weren't masters. They were enslavers, but they were like, oh, I'm a master, just like a blacksmith, and these are my apprentices. It's actually, master is a wholly inappropriate word, but it came to mean slave owner, and so we use this word boss. So anyways, the point is, I actually found this part of Graeber before I'd read Debt, but when it pops up in other times, very, very, very revealing, because I had just had these people who they were tape recording my classes, recording my classes. There's no tapes anymore, and they were scrutinizing them, and they were, frankly, it was the most degrading thing I had ever experienced. It was utterly degrading, and no matter who I talked to, they were all just like, "Well, you can rescue yourself from this, obviously, if you quit."
Yeah.
But as long as you work for them, their utter degradation of you is just their business. That's up to them.
What is it that you found so degrading about having your lectures recorded, for example?
Well, it wasn't
analyzed. What was it?
It was essentially every choice I made was scrutinized, and then I would get an email explaining how I did it wrong, and they were going to help me do it right. Actually, I did this entire process, and when I was done, they were like, "Okay, you have improved enough that you can keep your job, but we're going to keep helping you next year as much as we can." And I found that utterly degrading. I thought I was, autonomous to a certain extent within the classroom, and I had heard tales of high school teachers who were not autonomous, but I thought I was an agent. And Graeber, I heard Graeber say in a podcast, this, like, the ancient Greek definition of slave was someone who had to work for someone else. This is tying into this degrading thing. And so in that sense, that we put up with our bosses from behavior that an honorable Athenian citizen or Roman citizen would not put up with from anyone, no matter how powerful they are. That strikes me as true. I don't know. What does that strike you as true?
Well, I think there are cases where you could honorably submit to the rule of an equal, right? This is Aristotle. All democracy is about ruling and being ruled in turn. And you think of all the military discipline in these societies, and people were submitted to pretty severe discipline. But that was somehow compatible with them being a respected equal citizen, an honorable person. And in this case, well, I do want to say that our current legal system is not the same as Roman slavery. I do think there are significant differences. I would not go so far as to say that in most jobs, people have dignified work and are recognized as honorable, autonomous equals. I think that Graeber's quite right to say, and I like that part of his goal is to talk about how bad jobs are, right? And how relations in the private sector of employment, especially in the States, have this very boss subordinate type relationship. It's, I just have command over you during this time. Um, Another interesting book to look at, I don't know if you know Elizabeth Anderson's Private Government.
Yes, yes.
So again, she's saying, look, in the workplace, we accept treatment that we would never brook from our governments as citizens, right? This is the site of most people's actual everyday degradation and oppression. And I think that's quite right. And I think that coming as you do from a academic background where the ideology within the institution is that your colleagues, you're a group of equals, self-regulating. And that runs up against a more hierarchical managerial form of organizing the workplace, which is tyrannical. And if you if you think that you're an agent, you're you're going to feel pretty bad under the circumstances, as you did. There's probably, and your friends who say, hey, this is just what having a job is. They've probably somehow found a peace with their sense of autonomy and being able to have a job in the same way that a Roman soldier would have, been able to see himself as a free citizen and yet also submitted to pretty severe military discipline. Yeah, but I'm glad you're not in that job anymore.
Yeah, me too. I mean, a couple of things I was thinking of is, Orwell famously talks about how orders in the militia that he served in the Spanish Civil War were obeyed immediately because they were trusted and understood, and they didn't have, like if a commander gave an order, people just followed it. They didn't have like an anarchist committee forming like you would imagine the anarchists would be having, because they understood a common cause and a common purpose and the sort of reason to give up their autonomy. He also writes about how he knows it's over when the officers start wearing guns. I mean, I didn't understand this until I read Orwell, but the reason why, when you see military officers, all of the grunts have machine guns and the officers have a pistol, and I thought that was like, oh, maybe a leftover from honor, or maybe if like someone gets by the machine guns. No, the officer has the pistol to shoot the grunts if they are trying to run away. And Orwell says, we didn't need that.
Yeah,
we all obeyed our orders, and no one was going to get shot. But also, we wouldn't have dared disobey. We were there together, fighting for this thing, and we took orders under that term. I can understand that. I assure you that is not the circumstance, as you know quite well, at the average American workplace. And it does seem like degradation is sort of the heart of it, even if the Roman legal power of the father over the slave doesn't seem like, to me, like it's the heart of it.
Well, do you think like having strong labor laws mitigates the degradation of the workplace?
I mean, I'm not sure that I do, actually. I think having strong labor unions and would be much more useful than strong labor laws. Does that make sense?
Sure, but why? What is a significant difference in your mind?
Well, I think it would go. There's a lot of talk in the university about shared governance, which is a pretty meaningless term. But if the union has a major role in running the company, and you feel like you are part of the union, then it seems like degradation is no longer a useful or even an option for the people who are in charge. Whereas, when I had shit jobs when I was younger, like I scooped popcorn at a movie theater, we were required. We got federally mandated 15-minute breaks,
Yeah.
But you couldn't take your 15-minute break unless you were told you could take your 15-minute break. And sometimes you would get yelled at when there was only, you'd only been on break for 12 minutes. And like, there was lots of degradation, even though there was a strong labor law
Mhm.
that was being followed, at least within the letter of the law.
Right.
And if we had been communally running that movie theater, first of all, I'm pretty sure we all would have worked harder and it would have been a better movie theater. And secondly, there would have been a lot less degradation. That's the distinction I would suggest between a strong labor law and
Mhm.
strong labor control or role in the workplace.
All right. I think, look, I agree. Stronger unions are going to be better for workers, and everyone should have them. But what I was trying to point out with laws, but it could be laws, it could be unions, it could be organizing things as a co-op, etc., is just there are different ways of arranging labor and of conceiving of the relationship between employer and employee than the one that you have when you get your teenage job in the movie theater, right? And I'm sure you've had experiences with different kinds of employment and different kinds of workplaces where you do feel a little bit more of an agent, right? It's a little bit less degrading. And some of the factors may be that there's a union, that's a really important one, that there could be laws in different countries, the assumed relationship between boss and grunt is not the same. And so, yeah, there's just I think there's a lot of different kinds of governance, and some are more conducive to a sense of dignity, and some are more degrading.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. The only other thing I feel like I feel like I should say, I usually say this when this topic comes up, is I was listening to someone talk one time and they said that Orwell in 1984 was wrong. We actually are living in Huxley's Brave New World because we're all being controlled by mindless entertainment and drugs and everything. And I read someone say, I can't remember who, I don't think it was Graeber, that like 1984 is true when you're at work. Like that's
Oh,
this
right.
is perfect for the private governance thing. Is like people are imagining that Big Brother is the president of the United States or the premier of wherever
Yeah.
you are, and they're like, oh no, my life isn't like that at all. There's no one watching me through a video screen who degrades me constantly. That's not part of my life, but it totally is part of our
Yeah.
it is part of our lives for most of us. We are being constantly watched and degraded. We just have Huxley, for 8 hours. We have 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours
Yeah.
of Huxley, and 8 hours of 1984 to update the old
I like
888
that. I think that's
theory.
cute.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think it's mostly right, and it does seem. I'm very skeptical of this whole domestic is why this happened. But I do think that there's something to do with the power that bosses have over workers, which is connected, I think, both to the factory employment of the Industrial Revolution and the plantation slavery, which is, I've seen argued and I think makes sense, is also uh, a form of factory employment as well.
Uh-huh.
I think stretching it back to ancient Athens is probably a bridge too far. But the idea that modern African chattel slavery
Mhm.
and the factory system sort of grew up together, and our current social contract theory, it's right there, contract, that
Mhm.
that we can buy and sell ourselves and our time, are tied into this modern idea of slavery. Does that sound right, even if stretching it for 2000 years is probably too far? Certainly the Luddites and the other workers of that era thought that. They thought, you're treating us like machines,
Uh-huh.
or you're treating us like slaves. Those were the metaphors that they used.
Yeah. If the question is, do I think that chattel slavery and early industrial labor were degrading and oppressive, and that they have had a huge influence on what we conceive to be a normal relationship between workers and owners, then yeah, I agree completely. I
Yeah.
don't know what else there is
Yeah.
to say. Um,
Yeah, that is the claim I was trying to
yeah.
make. You've put it quite well.
In terms of the domus and the self alienation, people were alienating their own freedom more in the ancient world, whereas sort of in African chattel slavery, it was being alienated for them. uh, as it were. And yeah, there are going to be a lot of differences between those, but I guess the parallel of the modern labor contract of that we can alienate our freedom for a certain amount of time is true, and we do put up with a lot of oppressive behavior from employers. But I still feel that it doesn't necessarily have to be that way in all situations of employment. And just, because internationally, in places that have had stronger labor movements, you see stronger protections for workers in different kinds of assumptions than you do in the States, for example.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And most of the governments today are working under some sort of Western Lockean, Hobbesian inspired form of social contract
Yeah.
theory, and not everyone is working under these conditions. I think that's right. I did realize one other thing I wanted to ask you about before I say if there's anything else that you've got that you wanted to talk about
Mm.
is as I was going through the chapter, this isn't one of the topics I sent you, I came across that theory that I'd forgotten about is in the chapter where he says that slavery is death. And I wanted to
Mm.
see what you thought about this idea. It's maybe not quite in the run of our conversation, but just he references a Egyptian scholar who argues that to become a slave
Uh-huh.
is to have experienced death. So like if someone's standing over you with their sword, they
Right.
say, like gotcha. Like
Right.
like -1 life to you. And now you are a slave. And I wanted to see if that sounded right to you.
Okay, now I'm totally captivated by the standing over someone with a sword. And so, how did you start that again?
If you're in battle, you're standing over someone with
Yeah,
a sword, right? And you say, "Gotcha!" Right? Like
yeah,
tag,
yeah.
you're it. Like you got two options, buddy. I can cut your
Right.
head off now, in
Mm.
which case your life is over, or you're my chattel slave, in which case your life is over.
Yeah.
Your
Oh, is
your
slavery
your
death?
choice.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So this is part of why Graeber is so fun and suggestive because he says a bunch of things that are also the same words and are kind of related, and we're like, what is exactly the argument here? Like, I'm excited. I'm seeing new interesting connections. Um, so that is a classic way of getting slaves, right? You say exactly, you're dead or you're mine, and that's one thing. Um, but there's also a whole discourse of slavery or dishonor as social death. So Orlando Patterson writes about this a lot. Um, and for he and Graeber, a lot of it is pulling people completely out of their social networks, all of their relationships. They no longer have a life. If a human life is based on relationships, interactions, etc., status with people you know and love, and you're alienated from that and pulled from your context, then in a way you're dead. There's another way, which is even all these like posh dueling guys back in the early modern period, they would talk about dishonor as a kind of social death. And it wasn't that they were going to be shipped across the ocean and enslaved. Not at all. They get to keep their property. They get to keep their household. It's overall in that society not that bad. But the idea is people would sort of shun them. And so it would be a cutting off, they would be severed from certain social contexts. And in that way, if your life is enacting these social roles, once you're excluded from that, that's a form of social death. So, I mean, there's not that many levels of physical death, but there are a lot of levels of social death, and they can be applied both to dishonor of all kinds, but one of the extreme kinds would be slavery. Because if you think your life is your life as a free person with a certain status, and you're deprived of that, that's a form of death.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, this sounds almost like a version of the what does he call them, the human economies, but
Right.
existing within a regular economy, an economic economy. I don't know. All right. Well, we've talked for less than an hour, which was my goal. We've covered what I wanted to cover, and now it's just a chance for me to say, is there anything else you wanted to make sure that we talked about before we got out of here?
I would say for me, the easy way the sort of basic way of thinking about honor is as kind of Graeber Zen, as the bad conceptual bad guy. It's something that slave masters had. It's something that aristocrats had. It's something that's comparative. It's the bad way to think of recognition. But I would say that for me and a lot of like other writers, they see honor as a way of mediating relationships between equals, particularly without essential authority. So this is why I thought you might be especially interested in the concept, because one of the key differences is, honor is about relationships between free equals, whereas a legal society, at least on the Hobbesian view, is a relationship of a bunch of different individuals in an all-powerful state, right? And whilst honor always does have kind of a lot of conflict, maybe a lot of violence, I think that's part of the price to pay to have relationships based on equal respect. We wouldn't have to necessarily if we were all living in constant fear of a Hobbesian Leviathan, or if we're all pursuing our self-interests. But looking at honor isn't just for learning how bad and sexist and stuff people in the past were. It's also for understanding a way that people could like enact respect and demand respect. So there's a lot of cases where, we want to say honor was bad, but then we look at, when things are starting to get equal in European countries like France and Germany, and bourgeois people started to get included, they became very interested in dueling and taking offense and talking about honor. When in the 19th century in France, there was a whole phenomenon of Jewish duels. So anti-Semitism was getting really big. And so all these, posh Jewish guys were going out and challenging people to duels on that basis. And in many cases, all these struggles over honor were ways of people who were either previously excluded or about to be excluded to sort of stand up and fight for equal status. So that's just, to me, a more fun and interesting way to think of it when you're reading stuff about honor than, oh man, it was so bad. Lucky we have dignity today. Because there's a lot of continuities.
Yeah, I mean, the way you describe it, it does sound like something Graeber would like. It does sound anarchist. So we're all equals here. There's no hierarchy, and yet within our equality, there's gradations, and those gradations are not quantitative, and they're sort of communally assessed over time by people's ideas about one another as these agents are acting within this structure. That sounds good to me.
Yeah. And essentially, as equals, there are certain ways you can't treat us. And if you do, there'll be some kind of enforcement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that sounds great. That's fascinating. Thank you, Cliff. Anything else? This is great.
Just, great talking to you. Thanks for having me back on. It's good to catch up. And this is a long project you're doing with debt. I'm glad you're doing it.
Yeah, it might wrap up in 2024. It might wrap up in 2024, but it might sneak over into 2025. But it'll be done eventually.
Find some other way to occupy your time once you're done.
I'll figure out a way. All right, Cliff. Thank you again. This is a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, Graham.